Welcome to the intersection of Black culture and horticulture with your girl, Colah B Tawkin. And guess what, y'all? We Black in the garden.
The cultivation and care of plants fascinates humans everywhere. It's a defining hallmark of our species and key to our survival. But the discourse of horticulture and gardening tends to favor some viewpoints and overlook others. Like so many universal conversations, this one often gives the most volume to voices of privilege. That's where the WABE podcast, Black in the Garden, comes in, hosted by gardener, researcher, and plantrepreneur Colah B. Tawkin. It's a podcast series amplifying the experiences and expertise of Black plant keepers, offering alternative perspectives and historically overlooked stories of Black achievements. Colah B. Tawkin joins me now. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an incredible honor, Lois. I used to listen to your show before I was even interested in plants, and in my past life, I was a trucker.
I read that.
Yes, and I used to drive around Atlanta on 285, somewhat lost, but with direction, but listening to your show, particularly at night. So just hearing you takes me back to that space.
I'm so grateful to have been in that space for you, especially when you were getting lost.
Yeah.
We need companionship. And
absolutely.
More of it. You are one of the fascinating and amazing stories. I mean, you're heard in more than 90 countries.
This is true.
This is pretty amazing. You know, I've been here 45 years and Metro Atlanta hears me, but 45 countries. Well, gardening is a practice that many people on Earth, past and present, have participated in, and at some point, directly or indirectly. And yet so much of what surrounds gardening seems oriented around white and European traditions.
Yeah.
In fact, in a game of word association with garden, for instance, English pops to mind.
Yes.
The beautiful English
cottage.
Yes, the country garden. What are we missing when we whitewash the practice of gardening?
Oh, so much. That's almost a loaded question because there's so much missing. The concept of like an English garden, a cottage garden, even just the aspect of our lawns as we know them is a very sterilized concept that the Europeans, it was important for them to have things be very tidy, very, a certain type of way, but not so much appreciating the beauty of like the organic nature of how plants just naturally come about. And the cultivation practices from different parts of the world, especially from different parts of Africa, and just the biodiversity that exists in the continent of Africa being greater than everywhere else in the world in some ways. So by focusing on a very specific and what I like to consider a sterilized viewpoint of gardening, that's what's missing from the conversation is the organic aspect of it, the ancestral practices and the wisdom that have been passed along through generations of my ancestors, for example, and that even being the real reason why they were selected to be transported to the United States to become what I call involuntary gardeners.
And also having brought from Africa some horticultural traditions that not only enabled those enslaved people to survive once they were here, but enriched our culinary traditions. Sweet potatoes, peanuts.
Yes.
Thinking about these marvelous plants. Well, plantrepreneur is a word you coined. I love it. Very clever. Please tell us about your history with gardening. When did you first discover your thumb was green?
I love how this is connected. The plantrepreneurship is connected to me discovering my green thumb, because it kind of was intentional with what I was doing in the beginning of gardening. I just was trying to figure out how to grow my own food, because I was on this organic journey from going to college and starting with natural hair and, making that transition as a young Black woman to later in life having children and being able to have a natural birth, a water birth with my daughter. And then as I'm going through that part of my journey and doing things natural, creating my own cleaning supplies and like making granola from scratch, I was like, what can I do to have the shortest pipeline from where my food comes from to me? And I realized it was gardening. And was I good at it at first? Absolutely not. I definitely failed. And that's what I mean by it kind of being an accident, because when I wasn't really trying to grow something, there was this plant, Coleus, which is a very popular plant seen in many landscapes. And I got a Coleus plant from some store. And I remember putting it outside. I was in Florida at the time, and a piece of it broke off in a part of the soil that was wet from recent rain. And when I came back a few days later, I noticed that it was like roots were coming out. And I was like, oh, wow, I think I might be a gardener for real now.
Oh.
And so I was just organically and spontaneously and unintentionally learning about propagation from that experience. But when I realized one plant could produce multiple other plants, then I started thinking entrepreneurially about what if I decided that I wanted to sell plants, because the profit there is 100% or very, it's a high profit margin if I'm able to take one plant, divide it into a bunch of more, and sell it at a certain rate.
You mentioned the idea of one seed and so little expense, from which literally so much grows and flourishes. When we hear about farm-to-table restaurants,
Yes,
fine dining, Michelin stars, it's a big deal if they have a garden right outside. Thinking about Alice Waters and Chez Panisse and how radical that was in Berkeley, California. But so much of it seems class skewed.
for sure.
You were talking about involuntary gardeners and enslaved gardeners. How can we get more people to realize growing is fun, growing is beautiful, growing can sustain or even prolong your life?
Absolutely.
You're doing it with your program.
Yes, yeah, for sure. I love that I figured out how to combine a few talents, my ability to speak well and my ability to be creative and articulate my ideas, and have this obsession with plants and Black culture and able to combine all of those. But to answer your question, it's very important in me realizing that I could do all of that in order to create this platform called Black in the Garden that is celebrating. It is primarily celebratory. Yes, we do mention the enslavement of my Black ancestors, but that is not ever the core of what the story is that we want to tell. That's not what we want the audience to focus on. We want it to be celebratory because when we feel celebratory, then we feel that much more excited and positively towards that act. When we're hearing people talking about it in a way where not only are they saying how it changed their life, but they're also just very excited about it, that can be contagious, and it can definitely change the narrative, change the perspective, create a little counter narrative, and make people more inclined who may not have thought about gardening before they heard something like Black in the Garden to feel like, okay, I can connect with this. This is a millennial kind of hip looking Black woman who is making it sound fun and exciting to me and talking to certain people who I might resonate with. So I could see how that could work in that way.
And you don't need a 3-star Michelin restaurant to enjoy delicious vegetables or fruit.
Absolutely not. I love that you brought up the classist aspect of it, because I remember when I first got a little bit better about growing food and I started going through seed catalogs and looking at the various varieties of vegetables and fruits that were available. I thought about how in my grocery store experience, I had only seen that at a place like Whole Foods or like a high-end place. And I realized that when I go to a grocery store in a Black neighborhood or a neighborhood that is economically depressed, I'm not seeing that same variety. But what I loved that I recognized about the ability to grow your own food is that you can grow all those pretty exotic, kind of vegetables and fruits in your own home and be able to create in your home that Michelin 5-star, 3-star experience.
And not pay $7 or $8 for an heirloom tomato.
Exactly. No whole paycheck. Just just a few packs of seeds.
Well, you mentioned that you enjoyed combining some of your strengths and talent to put into this podcast, and that speaking is among them. With your move into radio and broadcasting, you cited the inspiration of iconic voice actors and radio jocks. How did you get into radio and establish yourself as a commentator?
I love that question. And I love that you mentioned the voice actors, because like Mel Blanc was the first voice actor as a child who was obsessed with Looney Tunes that caught my attention. What you know about Mel Blanc?
What I know about Mel Blanc is he was Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny. He was
all of the Looney Tunes.
Voice of Looney Tunes. A brilliant actor and so versatile. And Bugs Bunny is one of my favorite, among my heroes.
Yeah. Hilarious, by the way. I was watching Bugs Bunny last night just to get my morale up, those classic cartoons.
Looney Tunes, Muppets, Sesame Street. Yes, this is public broadcasting. But they always seemed so much more real for me than a lot of the Disney stuff.
That's the culture of the Warner Brothers productions is how I would put it, because if we really get real about the Looney Tunes, some of them did not age well. They were, the way that some of them are just banned, like some of the things that they were saying. Just the one that I was watching last night, there was a drunk guy, he's clearly his eyes are red, but as kids, we were laughing at that, and so bringing it back to today. It was Mel Blanc who I first noticed when I'm looking at those credits on the Looney Tunes cartoons. And then they did a remake, Tiny Toons. And that's where Cree Summer came in as the voice of Elmira. And she being just as iconic and just as multi-talented and diversely talented as Mel Blanc. And when I realized that she was a Black woman, when I saw her on A Different World, that was a game changer.
Sure.
I was just like, wow, I love cartoons. And I naturally felt inclined to say, I would like to be a voice actor in my, adulthood. That was what I said I wanted to be. If you asked me when I was a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? That was my answer.
Really?
And it had a lot to do with those two voice actors. But then when I got to college and I was trying to figure out, okay, this life path that you're supposed to be choosing when you're selecting your major, I knew that I wanted to do something in communications because I ended up flunking out of whatever science major that I thought that I was going to do. I'm not the math girl. I say that all the time. I'm just not that person. But when I was getting ready to flunk out and I had to make a decision to change to the course that would be best suited for me, and I sat down with myself and said, what are you actually good at? Because that's what you need to find a way to legitimize on paper via a degree in order to pursue a career in that. And that's when I realized it's communications. There's a college radio station here. I was at the University of North Florida. Shout out to the Ospreys. And I went down, like after I made that decision, within a week or two, I was down to the station. I had got trained and I started doing a show with my friends, just having fun and talking, because I knew that as much as I loved the radio jocks that I heard growing up in Jacksonville, Florida, I knew that it was the talking aspect that was more fascinating to me and aligned with what I would actually see myself doing in the broadcasting world than spinning records so much. Mm-hmm.
Oh, and to think this all started with a voice actor who gave cartoon characters New York accents.
Right.
Exactly.
That's what he was doing.
So funny. Well, I'm curious about your personal inspirations behind Black in the Garden.
Mm-hmm.
For the audience you had in mind,
Mm-hmm.
what needs did you see that had to be fulfilled for your audience?
For sure. Well, I would start with what I was looking for when I was first looking for Black voices and faces in gardening media. Because when I became interested in it and wanted to learn more about it, I was going on like YouTube and social media, because I didn't even search like TV, public television, and no shade because we're on it technically, but I knew that there were not Black anchors or like hosts that were leading the charge around that kind of programming about gardening, whether it was how to do it or just discussing the culture of it. And so in looking for my audience, I looked within first and I said, well, this is what I'm looking for. And I know that I'm not alone in looking for this. And so when I'm looking for people of color in general that are presenting garden related content, I was also looking for personality. I was looking for it to be fun. I was looking for it to be interesting. And I came across whoever I came across, but I don't want to throw any shade to anybody to say that their shows were not interesting enough to me. I just recognize there's a void here in this particular genre. So I know I'm the best person to fill it. And there's a show that I want to hear. And I'm going to have to be the one to create that show for that reason.
I've had the pleasure of interviewing some Black farmers reclaiming land here in Georgia and urban farmers. Mm-hmm. And I was hoping you could give us some of your insight into the lives of Black growers and plant and nature lovers.
Oh, yes.
How these enthusiasts add to creating community.
Oh, they're doing an amazing job in Atlanta in particular. If you're not familiar with urban farming overall, generally in many, or if not all, metropolitan areas where there is a high concentration of Black people, there is a robust urban gardening community. Atlanta is no different. Atlanta influences everything. And so, there are so many urban farmers and people who are adjacent to them that are doing work that is supporting them. My favorite example being a guest that we had on this season, Michaela from Black to Earth, who facilitates volunteer days with Black farmers and makes sure that for every volunteer day, there are at least 10 volunteers that go to one Black farm and help them for the day for several hours. And at the end, there's a meal, there's community, there is, there's a celebration of what we just did to give back to the earth. And that's the name of the organization, is Black to Earth. For example, I love to name that because that is touching on the urban farming aspect, but also relating it to the support that is needed there for those people. As robust as the community is, support is always needed, especially when you consider that Black farmers make up less than 2%, 3%, it kind of fluctuates, but make up less than 3% of farmers in America. And that
That's
is not by
mind-blowing.
accident. It's incredible. Yes. And so that's just one of the things that we are that is one of the things that is part of the counter narrative that we are cultivating on the Black in the Garden platform, because we want to, how can there be more Black farmers if they're not inspired to get out and consider what that way of life could be?
What are some highlights from recent favorite episodes of Black in the Garden?
Ooh, recent favorite. We always mix it up. We haven't quite yet had a theme for a season that is just kind of like one thing. So highlights for me are finding the opportunity to make a connection between Black culture, botany, or plants or nature or whatever, and pop culture, for example. So in having a conversation about like the botany of Wakanda, for example, and considering that film and how the main character draws their strength from an herb. That's one example. But most recently, we've talked to so many people. We've talked about the language of flowers. I think that was the first episode that we put out for this season.
Sounds so poetic.
It's very poetic. And we think positively about the messages that we are sending when we share flowers with each other. But there's a whole language that came from like the Victorian era where they were sharing flowers, but there was a message behind it,
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one example.
Some were racy.
Yeah, some were racy. It was an interesting time. And having the ability to connect with local entrepreneurs and plant enthusiasts, and even being able to make the connection between, I like to call it what plants got to do with ... And in a recent episode, we had Elle Sharpton on, and we discussed what plants had to do with beer. And I think it was maybe the day after I had attended your Loggers with Lois event. So it was just... So we discussed, not just the connection between Black culture and the agricultural aspect of brewing. And, there is a plant at the root of that, which is hops and wheat and grains. And so we're discussing how Black farmers are tapped into to contribute what they're growing on their farm to beers, that being the final product. Isn't that a fun connection?
Yes, and I think many beer lovers would enjoy knowing that they are part of a plant-based diet trend.
That's how I think about it. I'm just like, listen, leave me alone with my beer salad, okay? Because I'm going to have me a beer from time to time.
I think about what you were saying again about Black to Earth and the richness being there, the ability to survive from what you can grow. And it reminds me of something I once read about Michelle Obama's mom, Mrs. Marilyn Robinson. From the time that her children were very young, she emphasized the importance of education. I think their father echoed that, but Mrs. Robinson said something to Michelle that I read that I just thought was profound, because she told her an education is something they can't take away from you. The earth, the land, can't take that away from you.
Yes, the knowledge of plant cultivation.
And the soil itself, even if you don't own that piece of earth, you can cultivate it.
For sure.
For food, for sustenance, for beauty.
Yes. You make me think about this concept called guerrilla gardening, where people go wherever they feel that they should go and they plant what they want to plant in that place, and they don't ask for permission. They just, you know how that saying goes, you ask for forgiveness instead of permission. And one guest that I would love to have on the show, Ron Finley, is a great example of that. He's one of the, I would say, I guess, celebrities in this space of Black gardening. And
are you the queen in that space?
I'll go ahead and claim that.
Okay.
Somebody hand me my crown, because I'm ready to claim that. But the thing that really put Ron Finley on the map, not to trivialize anything else that he's done, but he was growing food in the median of, some people call it the hell strip, of the community that he was living in Los Angeles. And he was penalized for that. And it became a whole back and forth between him and the local authorities. And he got in some trouble about it, but he persisted that, no, this should be something I should be able to do. I'm only adding value and beauty to this space. And so what ended up happening was that the laws were changed as a result to make it so that you were not prohibited from doing that type of thing in that particular area.
Oh, that's
Remarkable.
transformative. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Your research is extensive. In interviews, you talk about going to the library, which I love.
Yes.
Not that there's anything wrong in being able to Google or do word searches online, but you often bring up some extraordinary figures in the history of Black gardening and horticulture, names we don't know widely, beyond George Washington Carver.
Yes.
Who are some trailblazers in the field, are or were names we should know?
Absolutely. I love that you mentioned the library, because I remember, researching on the internet is, of course, easier and faster. But for the information I was looking for, with it being very specific, Black plant keepers, Black people adjacent to something related to the plant sciences, I had to go to the library because I wasn't finding it on the internet. And I'm grateful for that, because it grew me as a researcher in that way. And I came across Marie Clark Taylor, who was a Howard University professor. And she was a true scientist. She studied the way that light and plants were connected. She did a lot of research about how plants were affected by light. And what she noticed in her research was that the way that, not just in her research, but in her practice and her teaching, the students that she was teaching, and the way that other professors were teaching around her, they were not using tools that were helpful for the students to learn. They were not going out into the field in a way that was helpful for the students to learn. So with her noticing what was missing from the educational aspect, made her go on to teach other professors how to teach that science better.
Oh.
And I love emphasizing those kind of points, because there's Black plant keepers, of course, there's botanists and farmers and, hobbyists, but getting into the science and the research and those, I like to call them deep cut kind of careers in sciences, that many times, too often, unfortunately, the Black names and the Black stories are not at the forefront. So it's really a privilege to be able to emphasize people like her and make sure that people know about them.
Yeah. Now, you are the founder of the Underground Arborist. It's a nonprofit initiative. What are the goals?
So the goals are pretty simple: to plant a female indigenous tree in every state. Now, it sounds very simple, but it is a very big mission, when you consider planting a tree in every state. Thus far, we planted in about 7 states, and Florida was the last state earlier this year. But I just recognize that when it comes to the aspect of sustainability and environmental justice and the work that is, there's so much work that is being done by Black people and people of color, who unfortunately are the communities that are most impacted by environmental change. And environments that are polluted, you know? So I set out to plant a tree in every state to raise awareness for the fact that there are Black people who are involved in this work, and there's also a disparity, unfortunately, between how much funding and how much support the Black-owned initiatives receive. And I was inspired by a few things, especially the civil rights movement, and considering how they marched in mass in order to raise awareness. It wasn't that they were doing it for fun or for exercise by far, you know. And I also recognized that there was a gentleman named Hala Sidibe, and he had ran from the West Coast to the East Coast. This is a Black man. I think I said that. But this man ran from the West Coast to the East Coast in a very remarkable amount of time. And when I saw that he did something like that, I said, well, what's the plant version of me doing that? Like, I'm not that kind of runner to expect to do that, but like, is there a way that I could plant a seed or this or that?
Oh.
And just in having a conversation with a friend about what it would look like to plant something in every place that I traveled to, I was connecting those things. And then I became aware of Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan woman who was a Black woman, of course, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her ability to organize over 30 million trees being planted in her native land.
Oh, to think of what that reforestation
Right.
meant for breathing, for quality of life. It's something I came across in learning more about you is a phrase you've brought up, shade equity, and the importance of the need for trees in our neighborhoods. Sadly, trees tend to be lacking in many neighborhoods of color.
Unfortunately. And that's what I mean when I'm talking about environmental justice and the disparities that exist between certain neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods. Of course, redlining has a lot to do with that. I know you talk about that sometimes in conversations. And that concept of tree equity or shade equity has a lot to do with the many reasons why the Underground Arborist Initiative was important for me to take on, because where there is less trees, there is more heat in a world that is heating up. And so we really can't afford to have less trees. We need them now more than ever. You know, it's a slow growing kind of effort. So we have to start right away. We were supposed to start like years ago, but, you know, we're just doing the best that we can.
I think related to the Underground Arborist, you also have some do-gooder initiatives like the Pumpkin Project.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
The Pumpkin Drive. I started this concept, this movement, if you will, that I call the Compost Society. And I just remember it was 2020. It was the height of the pandemic. It was, you know, October. This is a seasonally relevant initiative because it's specifically aiming to divert pumpkins from the landfill. And so what I realized was happening as I was experiencing what I call eco-anxiety. It's a real thing. It's not something I made up, but the concept of knowing that there's kind of like this sense of existential dread because we know that the environment and climate change is happening at such a rate and we're not really sure how much impact that we can have. So in sitting in that anxiety, and what happens for me when I'm anxious is I can't help but think, what can I do about this? Feeling very powerless, but also recognizing that if I could somehow mobilize in some way and get other people to be aware of the simple ability that we have to take that jack-o'-lantern, you know, make sure it doesn't have glitter and wax and all that, you know, chemicals on it and paint, and give it back to the earth. Don't throw it away. We're just in a culture where everything's fast and everything is disposable and it's one use, single use, this and that. And it's so bad that when we have organic things, pumpkins are part of our fall decor, starting around Halloween, going into Thanksgiving. And so I realized if I start saying something right now, about how we can know what to do with our pumpkins and compost them and direct people on where they can go to do that, then I can at least make some kind of impact. So that started in 2020, did it again in 2021, took a couple years off just trying to figure out some life things. But 2024 came back and working with some local partners here, Historic Westside Gardens, for example, in collecting pumpkins from those sites, because the sites are very important in people having places to take them to if they're not going to compost them on their own. And in just making noise about it this year, I was able to expand the initiative from Atlanta, where it began, to working with organizations in Jacksonville, Florida, Durham, North Carolina, and Philadelphia. So we're increasing our impact in that way by uniting with other organizations that are doing similar types of things. Because I'm not the only one who thought of this.
Well, but it's so easy.
Yes.
If people would just do it. So my bestie started composting.
Mm-hmm.
We would bring her our food scraps. I don't know about daily, but very often.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of months after she started, she invited us over for what we thought was a meal.
Mm-hmm.
And we sat down at her table and she brought out a cantaloupe.
What? That she grew?
Yes.
With the compost?
In her backyard in Morningside.
I didn't know where you're going with that story.
Well, but here's the thing, Colah. What was funny, because, we live smack dab in the middle of town,
Mm-hmm.
and love our neighborhood, but there's a lot of concrete.
Yes.
And when she put it on the table and announced this was the result of our compost, it was like it was a sacred object.
Yeah.
I don't think a bite of cantaloupe ever tasted as sweet as it did.
I love that for y'all. I really do. How did she put it on the table? Did she place it gently, or did she slam it? Look what I did.
No, she placed it on
Gingerly.
a platter.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's like, look at this. Look at this thing that landed out of nowhere. So all that beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Well, along with plantrepreneur, I've heard you described as a garden futurist.
Ooh. Who you been talking to?
I read that somewhere. When you wear the hat of a garden futurist,
Uh-huh.
Colah, what are your hopes for future generations? Trying to offset the eco-anxiety you mentioned.
Ooh. My hopes really for the future is that the kids get involved more. I'm involved with an organization that is working with the American Public Gardens Association called Seed Your Future. And being an ambassador for Seed Your Future, what their goal is to increase the amount of young people who are interested in what we call green careers, whether they be horticulturally centric, agriculture. There's so many sciences and there's so many industries within that industry, making up the larger umbrella of the green industry, as I said. But there's an aging out kind of factor that's happening right now, because the narrative around those jobs is maybe not considered by young people as much as it was in a different generation. And so Seed Your Future is working very intentionally with so many institutions, colleges, schools, and things like that in order to create a pipeline, a very sustainable and robust pipeline to help young people, and particularly Black kids and people of color, to pursue those career paths. We just had a career day at the Fern Bank, in fact, where, we're tapping in with the kids to make sure that they are aware that there are so many opportunities in that field. When I talk about plantrepreneur and I shared the story about propagation, that's one way that I thought of about how I could just turn a profit with plants. But when I consider just jobs in general that are plant centric, that's a plantrepreneur, and there are so many economic opportunities in horticulture, agriculture, and the green industry that I would want young people to know about. So that's why I work with that organization. But that is putting action behind my hope for the future, which is for the next generation to carry this forward.
Thank you so much for all the work you are doing on behalf of all of us and for joining me. This has been a joy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you.
Black like the root of my hair, from the top of my head to the soles of my feet. Ay, yeah, black like the root of my hair. I'ma go what I eat in the garden where I be, yeah, be.
WABE.